So my talk is called Addressing Space-Time Diagrams, Kinetics, Notation and Flat Time in the Work of John Latham. The basic T diagram is a drawing, a symbolic key to unlock the meanings of the letters at the top of the sculpture called Time-Based Roller with Graphic Score. Both works are expressive of John Latham's theory of flat time, his theory that it is time and event that are key to the understanding of the universe rather than mass and space. Both works present us with a time-based spectrum as a means of classifying events and what frequency they are operating in. Some of my understanding of the following is from a talk by the curator at Flat Time House, Gareth Bell-Jones, and some is from a paper by Athanasios Velios called Creative Archiving, a case study from the John Latham Archive. The letters at the top of the sculpture represent different frequencies or time bases. On the left, shorter, lower bases are representing events with a lower impact. On the right, longer, high bases are events which have high impact. A represents the duration of the shortest event possible within the laws of physics. These are events which are too quick for human perception. A also represents 1/24th of a second, the duration of a single frame of film. M, in the middle of the cylinder, represents the duration that are experienced by humans. P, Q, and R grouped together. They represent three different types of human approaches to the universe. P is instinctive and bodily, Q is rational, and R is intuitive. U represents the duration of all the events in the entire universe, and Z represents the duration of all possible universes. The time-based roller is a kinetic artwork. It's composed of a long canvas rolled around a barrel that rotates when a switch is pressed and unwinds until the canvas is fully extended. The entire canvas is a timeline of the universe, with the black markings in the middle representing events happening while time passes. There are regular notches and also a strip of spray paint splashes. These spray marks call to mind Latham's 1-second drawings, which represent least events. Viewers stand in front of the work, and they can only see the back of the canvas. The marks that we can see are merely leaks of ink that have seeped through the canvas. We can only see the front of the canvas while it's rotating around the roller at the top. This represents how our experience of time is brief in comparison to the entirety of the time of the universe, which is represented by the length of the canvas. Once the front of the canvas has rolled away from us, our experience of time has passed and exists as a mere memory. Waiting for the roller to unfurl does emphasize the viewer's experience of time in encountering the work, but perhaps it's an interesting contradiction that by its unusual construction, the work also emphasizes the space of the canvas, what can be said to be a sheet of assertion, according to the semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce. The space we make on a sheet of paper or other type of material to make a diagram, to think through and to come up with different hypotheses through deductive reasoning, and then to come to some conclusion about them through rational, deductive and inductive reasoning. So Peirce said, the entire graph shall be regarded as expressing an assertion by an imaginary person called the graphist concerning a universe. And he also said, the diagram must then evidently be something that we can see and contemplate. So very interesting in relation to Latham's diagrams and sculptural works, that Peirce thought that the diagram has to be something that physically exists in the universe. This is a work called Observer 4. It's part of a series of works by Latham. This is the last in this series, and it expresses Latham's ideas about the three different ways people engage with reality, which is influenced by his reading of the book The Brothers Karamazov by the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. These three different ways of engaging with the world are represented by the letters P, Q, and R on the time-based roller. Mitya, the brother Mitya, is represented by the massive painted books. He is instinctive and spontaneous. On the Flat Time House archive, pressing the MA button gives you access to a random slideshow of documents. This is for someone who's a casual observer, wanting to flick through some images, but not really wanting to spend time reading the documents. Ivan is at the top. He's connected to his brother by a tube. He's rational and he observes his brother and avoids his impulsive behavior. On the Flat Time House archive, pressing the IA button gives you access to a highly structured index with items archived by date, medium, and location. This is for someone who's looking for facts. Alyosha is represented by the tiny white wedge at the bottom left. He stands apart, observing the other two. He's intuitive and reaching higher levels of insight than the other two. He represents Latham's view of the artist as an incidental person. On the Flat Time House archive, pressing the AA button gives you access to an intuitive search tool based on Latham's time bases and a soundwork by the artist Yacoob. This is for someone who studies the archive but also uses intuition to achieve further understanding and appreciation of Latham's works. Athanasios Velios' paper about the John Latham archive looks into the history of the archive profession and emphasizes the perceived role of the archivist as the keeper of truth. Following postmodern thinking and ideas about online open access archives, his paper, and I quote, introduces the concept of creative archiving as an alternative approach to archival practice. He discusses how Legatus, a research unit at the University of London, decided to create an online John Latham archive according to these principles. The idea is that the artist's ideas are not used to classify the documents themselves, but are used instead to structure how each viewer enters into the archive. As viewers, we have to choose which one of the three characters we want to adopt in our engagement of the archive. So here's my drawing that proposes that some people experience these three characteristics to different intensities, and sometimes we experience various combinations of all three. This is an earlier iteration of the time-based roller, without accompanying diagram or the letters at the top explaining the time bases or frequencies. Latham's son stenciled real and made-up words that can be read vertically down the canvas. They're quite faint here, but you can see them more clearly around the roller at the top. According to the notes Latham gave to the Tate, who own the work, the horizontal dimension of the cylinder is treated as a scale, with the whole history of time as its outer limits, a temporal version of the spectrum of light. There are 36 time-based bands which represent areas of human knowledge or principles of action, and here's my diagram of the work as a spectrum of light. Each band represents a duration 14 to 15 times that of the one on the left. There's an exponential growth in time. The words can be read vertically but also horizontally across all the canvases. And words are formed by accidental juxtapositions. These are images of Latham's paper written for the Association for Social Studies of Time conference in 1986. Latham talks about how, whereas language and the disciplines of physics support the primacy of space and object in our understanding of the universe, Latham advocates for a T version of time, a time and event-based framework that is expressed as art and action. Latham argues that our activity orders time. He says, in the main, the concept of time is that of an experience of something passing endlessly, measurable by clocks and passive. I reject this concept as of no structural relevance whatever. He describes instead what he calls artist time in relation to someone he names Joe, a typical member of the artistic bent. Latham says, the normal position in clock time is horizontal and inert, but when an artist gets an impulse to do something, they suddenly get resources and capacities that defy explanation. Whilst this impulse is in operation, they realize the artwork. During the realization of the work, time has become a dynamic, as opposed to a passive component of the action, and only nominally related to clock time. Latham says, while making the artwork, Joe has been ordering time bases. And in relation to intuition, the semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce says, there is no intuition or cognition not determined by previous cognitions. It follows that the striking in of a new experience is never an instantaneous affair, but is an event occupying time and coming to pass by in a continuous process. Athanasios Velios points out that Latham classified all possible events in his 1976 Tate publication, Time, Base and Determination in Events. So in the middle, we can see biophysical events, for example, human events such as birth, death or illness. Then next is socio-political events which last for longer than a human life, for example, institutions or political parties. Then there's geopolitical events such as the duration of countries or religions. And then lastly, there's geophysical events such as planetary alterations and events caused by human activity with a long-term impact on the environment, such as the melting of the ice caps. So this is a table in Latham's document, Event Structure, Approach to a Basic Contradiction. It classifies both film and music as time-activating media, as opposed to the media of classical art. Both the music and film operate by ordering a series of event structures. Latham states that film was invented for the purpose of stimulating the passage of time, but it is actually a series of still pictures, atemporal signs that are passed before the viewers at precisely the frequencies that creates the illusion of the passage of time. This conceals the event structural basis which film as a medium possesses. This aspect of film is highlighted towards the ends of his film Earth, when frames of the pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica speed past us too quickly to read. So this is a still of the film Earth, so I'll show some of this film during the discussion. Latham called his time-based roller graphic score, suggesting it arranged time bases, the components of the universe, in a musical score of the universe. Interestingly, physics also link, analogously, the particles of the universe, tiny strings, to music. The physicist Brian Greene says, much as different vibrational patterns of a violin string play different musical notes, the different vibrations of tiny strands in string theory were imagined to yield different particles of nature. Does this suggest that it's vibration, movement, that precedes matter in importance? Is this relevant to Latham's idea that time and event is more important than space and mass? Latham says, without the repetition within musical composition, music would be painful to listen to. What's important is not so much the passage of time, but an event structural order. These are diagrams, and he calls them diagrams, by the Polish composer Andrzej Panufnik, who was working in the UK from the 1950s onwards. His musical compositions are based on internal symmetrical structures within a framework and harmonic geometry. I think they are relevant to Latham in that a single flat diagram represents the structure of a time-based event, and time bases in the musical score illustrate different types of events. Here you've got sphere of harmony, sphere of rhythm, sphere of melody, and so on. The arrow of time. Why does time move forward? Latham's time-based roller moves up and down, suggesting that time can move both backwards and forwards, or that time is cyclical. What do scientists say about time? Newton invented 3 laws of motion, including the principle that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The laws of physics are time-symmetric. That is, they can run backwards as well as forwards, except for when it comes to the second law of thermodynamics, pioneered by the scientist Ludwig Boltzmann, which states that entropy only goes in one direction. It always increases because it's much easier for things to be untidy and random than for them to be ordered and tidy. This theory is used to explain why time moves forwards. The universe is moving from a state of low to a state of high entropy. However, for physicists, there is a paradox that they are still trying to resolve. How did the universe's low entropy state start in the first place, and what caused the Big Bang? The astrophysicist Adam Becker explains a theory held by Marina Cortez and Lee Smolin. The universe is made up of a series of entirely unique events, never repeating itself. Each set of events can only influence the events in the next step, so the arrow of time is built in. So my drawing is suggesting that the creation of a string of universes, with the color of each universe affecting the color of the next arrow, which generates the event of a differently colored universe, and so on. So that's it.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Mary.
I'll stop sharing.
There's a lot there. One of the things I was thinking of when you sent that text about the archive, I guess I could ask you what you think of this. It seems that the archive is as a kind of idea, and even the Latham archive that we've been accessing is very different from the dynamics or properties of a diagram. I mean, in terms of time and space.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether the attempt to offer 3 different routes in somehow, whether that's diagrammatic or not. I mean, I've got things to say about that, but I wondered if you'd have any thoughts about that, or I guess any of us.
In a way, it does emphasize time, the archive, the way they've set it up, because if you go into one route, you get the slideshow, and so that is almost like watching a film, so an edited film that somebody else has created. And I guess you could say it's diagrammatic because the way you enter into the structure is according to certain principles, and they're trying to illustrate the intuitive, the rational, and the instinctive approach. So you could say that you're activating a diagram as you enter into the archive.
And I'm not clear about Latham's intentions for the archive, but he archived his own work. Is that right?
He did.
Archived
yeah.
Because I've got a science fiction scenario, which is that the archive is a bit like a kind of AI, where Latham's downloaded himself, so he can survive death in some way.
It's the spirit of the archive.
Well, it was I was playing with this idea, and I was thinking of like the 0110 that I spoke about last week, and then the article you sent about creative archiving, where someone comes in and makes an interpretation which isn't the truth, but it's one more version perhaps of Latham. And I thought even in that, Latham survives in some way. Like there's a sort of transcending of death, which I don't know whether Latham would accept that or not. But if you saw just one more, if you saw it's like Kurzweil at Google. Kurzweil is a transhuman and believes that you can scan the brain eventually, because he invented the flatbed scanner, so he knows a lot about scanning, and thinks that you can download all that stuff into a box or a computer or whatever, a quantum computer or whatever they're going to be, and he will live, not physically, but then he can have another physical body. So the archive is a bit like Latham's, not body, but everyone talks about it as being so kind of random and difficult to manage. And having once visited his house when he's alive, it kind of that's the image I have. But what I don't know enough about writing operating systems, but I wondered whether what happens is we either take the Mitya, Ivan, or Alosha routes as 3 separate kind of operating systems, which allow us to kind of make Latham exist.
Well, the interesting thing about the Google guy who thinks that he can scan his brain and then he'll continue existing is that it means that he doesn't think that the body, your physical interaction with the universe has a place in your being or your character or your perception of the world.
Yes. Yeah. Well, what Kurzweil might think, and others like him, who I would say they're kind of transhuman accelerationists, is that you can transcend your body. There is an idea in the end that every atom will hold information. So some people have this idea. It's like Moravec, Hans Moravec had this idea that in the end the universe would become this giant computer, and that humans would have to adapt to that. Otherwise they'd be like people in diving suits trying to compete with AI that are like dolphins. But there's always like a physical aspect, like where does the electricity come from to power the computer? But again, I don't know enough. But so just to say one more thing, is the reason that I think it isn't quite like a diagram, and in that sense it can't truly be freed from its author, is that the Latham archive doesn't have an abstraction or an abstract element like a diagram does. Anyway, sorry, John.
Oh no, it's fine. No, it doesn't really matter. I think I think I've got too many crossed wires, like between the kind of the idea that you create an archive as a kind of immortality machine, and I must admit that I've sort of sensed that with our relationship to the Latham archive, that there's a kind of because it's an archive which is continually in flux and designed not to conform to the kind of principles of provenance and selection that the person you spoke about, the person
Athanasios Velios.
That's right, Athanasios' text. It's not doing that. That it also means that the provenance in the archive is never static and never still. So part of this sense of a kind of immortality or a continuing life, let's say, is to do with the fact that we will keep investing in the archive, and the archive will keep being reawoken and revitalized by our participation in it. I think can come across as like a Latham immortality machine. But I think but my understanding is that it's more to do with the fact that in the same way as Latham indexed his works so that when it was shown in a different context or moved to another gallery, it was indexed differently. He was trying to emphasize that work was a different event in time. So the archive is never going to be the same in time. It's always going to be changing, and I think it's more to do with that. Though I do like the kind of cyber gothic idea of a kind of AI immortality machine, but I don't think that's what Latham was going for.
No,
I like the metaphor.
I think you're right there. It's just my perception, maybe. I mean, it's an extraordinary archive. It's not. There's an archive of the art school that I work at, and the way it's being used is to kind of mine different aspects of the school. I don't think people would talk about it as containing the truth, but there is a sense in which it's to get to some kind of historical facts, whereas the essay that you sent us, Mary, suggests that this is a kind of the creative archiving is something that doesn't really sense that there's a kind of a truth, and in fact it could be that each creative archiving is, as you were saying, John, an event of some kind, a new instantiation. I think that's more like, I just say that is more like a living person than as something that's dead, and the Slade treat, like the 1950s as dead. But in the Latham archive, I guess there's an idea that you kind of revisit this material. So as you're saying, each time it's kind of new, because it doesn't actually exist in space as a thing. It's a kind of, or maybe it does exist in duration. Sorry, Dean.
I mean, it might. You could look at it through the lens of entropy in a way. I mean, one way to think of entropy, or one way to think of order, negentropy, is separation. Right. So the opposite of entropy is separation, and separation is order. Right. Order is the separating out of things. The cliche is the milk in the coffee, isn't it? I mean, you get kind of sick of that example. So there's kind of maybe two aspects. There's the kind of aspect of why something gets archived. What is that? What? I mean, I might kind of talk about this when I do my session, but someone's gone to some effort to separate some stuff out, right? It might be a big pile of stuff, but there's a mass, which I think is what you're talking about, David, that there's a kind of mass of stuff. And then there's the question of organising that matter, a bit like Diderot in the Encyclopedia defines knowledge as organised matter, right? Once we organise matter, then it becomes knowledge. So it's a kind of epistemological thing at that point. So there is this archive, but the ordering of it is it hasn't been systematized in a way that a kind of John Dewey library system has, right? So to organize things according to intuition, rationality, and instinct, like I think you were saying, Mary, doesn't really work because like your diagram, they're always involved with each other, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, in the same way that Peirce talks about firstness, secondness, and thirdness will always contain firstness and secondness, and so on. So that's quite messy in that sense. That's quite messy, and it's there are these kind of library systems. I mean, I used to work at I spent a summer working at the Guardian Picture Library. I'm sure it must have changed now, but there was actually a physical library of like photos and images, and it was run by this old Italian couple who used to go back to Italy every summer. But they were the only ones who kind of knew the system. It was so odd. It was their own very idiosyncratic system. So somebody would be brought in. I was brought in to cover someone else, but it took me 2 weeks to kind of get a kind of intuitive sense of what was going on. So I was at one point, I might have told you this story, but I was asked to, someone would call you up from the desk. It was from the G2 section of the paper, and they say like, I want a picture of a monkey on a typewriter, right? And you're thinking, okay, so there's other kind of cliche, isn't it, of kind of infinity, and but how long would it take a monkey to write the works of Shakespeare or a sonnet or something like that? So it's the question, where do I find this photo of a monkey on a typewriter? So I look under A for animal, and then under M for monkey, but that doesn't work. And then I look under M for monkey, and that doesn't work. And then I look under M for mammal, and then I find monkey under mammal. So it's kind of, but it's there's no way of knowing until you kind of spend time there and get a kind of feel for like, what would this person do? Because it's all in there. It's not a kind of, it's not a systematic kind of universal understanding of ordering that we all kind of, get to grips with kind of Dewey library system or something. Mm-hmm. So the John Latham archive seems, it hasn't. It's in some kind of order, obviously, but because of the nature of it as well, it has kind of different types of things in it, and they're all in the same archive. So that's also kind of odd. It's a bit like if you went to the difference between a library and a supermarket or something. So you get different kind of types of things in there, I think, including images, but also in terms of the kind of status of certain things are artworks, but certain things are like, letters to people, and maybe other things are the equivalent of like a shopping list or little notes and sketches and so on. So that's a. It's I don't know how that relates to downloading your brain, but I perhaps your brain is more like a kind of big heap of mess than a kind of Dewey library system.
Well, I don't think Latham probably thought about downloading his brain, as John says. That's just a sort of sci-fi story that I kind of worked with, because I think that we're sort of dealing with his presence all the time, even though he's not here, and that's kind of the effect. But I think you're right. What you opened up, Mary, for me was the question of one, whether the archive is trying to operate diagrammatically, which it might fail. It seemed that there were possibilities of thinking that about the archive, the Latham archive, with those three, what I was calling operating systems. It's an attempt to produce some kind of randomness, in diagramming, I think we've discussed before that there's a level of abstraction where a circle can be a government and then suddenly it can be turned into something else. There's a kind of gesture that can be made by the diagrammer or someone receiving the diagrammer. The abstract aspect of of a diagram makes it to an extent democratic, open to interpretation, a discursive thing. But the archive is often a database which is ordered in a certain way. So I think that the idea of creative archiving seems to try and to bring in some of that diagrammatic aspects. And the interesting thing is that Latham didn't deal really with entropy. I think he might say, "Oh, the ice is going to melt," but within his own work, somehow I don't see him dealing with entropy, and also he doesn't deal with gravity, because as I was saying last week, that he said if the graviton is discovered, I'll take everything back. That's it. That's the end of my theory. And there's a possibility that it has been discovered and that gravity is a property of the quantum, which means that there's space at the quantum level. But curiously, diagrams have a lack of gravity as well. For us to kind of operate, things have to be, in our imaginations, they don't have gravity. So I think that there's that aspect where instead of the archive being these kind of objects with material presence and existence and entropy, as John says, they exist again and again in different forms. But I think that it's like you can't. But it's almost like the archive weighs down any real attempt to go as far as the diagrammatic can. I mean, that's not a criticism, but anyway, I've got some images of artists that I want to show later, but I'll do it after everyone said something. But Terry Atkinson made an artwork which was supposedly an AI and had entropy in it, and I thought that might be interesting to show. But anyway, well, I'll see. I mean, other people might have something to say about the diagram.
Yeah, can I just before I'm happy for you to do that. It's something that what I thought was fantastic about Mary's presentation was the way you'd done your rendition of the time-based roller with the color spectrum, and that was really useful. It's a really interesting, because you've added something to the diagram which is explanatory, so you've kind of done something that more than the Latham diagram does. You've done something to that diagram which was really useful for me by bringing colour in, because all of Latham's sort of conceptual work seems to be black and white mainly. I mean, I might be wrong here. I'm not, but and by bringing colour in, it introduces something which I'm really kind of struggling to work out. And maybe we can get closer to it by bringing colour in, which is, I realised when you were saying frequency, that frequency is a oscillation of a wave, right? It's wave oscillation, but it's also recurrence. So how frequently do you go to the bakers, or frequency is also so it's recurrence and oscillation, and this thing between occurrence and oscillation. In terms of the spectrum, I can't quite understand it, but I know it's probably got something to do with this quantum problem of the wave and the particle, and the energies in waves and matters particular. I know that's, and so I don't know, Mary, if you by doing the color, did it by putting color into the time-based roller, did that elucidate something for you? How did that work for you? What did it do?
Well, I was looking at diagrams of wave frequencies and they do them as a wavy line, and I was kind of relating that also to string theory, and I was also relating it to, frankly, the colours of the rainbow and how they shift from one side to the other. with surprisingly red being quite dominant. Red starts pretty much just after the middle. So I'm not a physicist, so I don't really understand why red is so dominant. But that says something about I don't know much about how the length of the wave affects color, but I think it does. Yeah.
It does, yeah.
It's red shift, blue shift, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, infrared and ultraviolet and stuff. Because I mean, this is the way all these all these kind of different things get unified by Maxwell, really, by James Clerk Maxwell in the mid 19th century. So what I was talking about last week in terms of Chatelet's book on science and so on, but the idea that we have something like the North and South Pole, and they seem to be kind of geographically stuck within certain kind of locations, and that then turns out to be related to a kind of a field, an entire field, and then it's kind of Maxwell that that kind of unifies this theory where everything is vibrating. I mean, everything is simply these kind of and so what we experience as colour is obviously a small part of radiation in general. So everything is kind of radiation and vibrating. So I agree, it makes a lot of sense to bring in colour, both because it allows us to kind of intuitively grasp the diagram better, but also because it's actually referring to the reality of these different frequencies, the different frequencies, which is all that colour is. So.
Yeah, I thought the diagram was great too. I think what John said is absolutely true, and Dean. But for me, what was like a pleasing and startling shock is that I think that this is the diagram that Lee Smolin should try and use, because it's Lee Smolin is suggesting that what is a conventional view of the universe as having no time being, I think I suggested last week, Kip Thorne has that idea of the book, that we read the book and have a sense of flow of time, but actually the book is the complete universe and it's all there in one go. Whereas Smolin's model is, no, it's not a book. It evolves, and each kind of moment or event possibly produces new rules or new physical laws. So I think that the introducing colour is a great way of showing the universe changing, having difference in time. In a way, I also thought I did wonder whether you were thinking of Af Clint, who we'd discussed before.
Yeah.
You probably weren't, but I thought there was something really great about that. And in relation to John saying, "Oh, Latham only uses black and white," I think that is really interesting, because colour introduces affect and qualities, which, because it's a diagram that seems quite kind of point. I was going to use the word pointillist, but kind of grainy. It has painterly effects, which most scientific diagrams don't, unless the painterly effects do something. Have a role. So I think that was a really pleasing aspect of it. Go on, John.
Yeah, I just want to just draw a couple of parallels there. One is that Maxwell is one of the first scientists in the diagram that Latham drew of the convergence, 20th century convergence diagram. He's the first mathematician, physicist in that curve. I think it's aligned with Picasso on the other end of the spectrum. I can't remember, but I don't know if that makes sense. So it's interesting that Maxwell is he's well aware of Maxwell. And the other thing is what you just said, David, and about Lee Smolin in the Book of Time. And it triggered something that Mary mentioned about the Latham film, where she said something like, you view an encyclopedia but too fast to make anything out, right?
Yeah.
So the speed of the encyclopedia, what I understood from that, because it's like that's like an insight to me about what Latham's getting at. Also, all the book sculptures and the Scoob stuff, that there's a certain sense that the time of reading an entire encyclopedia, if you could do such a thing, like the information contained in the encyclopedia, which looks like all the knowledge, encyclopedically, all the knowledge of the world, right? That would be, I guess, the ambition of encyclopedic knowledge, is itself just an instance in this unfolding of the universe, that, you know, only at a certain point in time do humans have this cognitive, epistemological impulse to try and capture all knowledge of the universe. But from a big time perspective, of course, it's a tiny little blip.
Yeah.
So I just had an insight there about the time of the book, the time of reading, is both a time in itself of duration, but relative to the roller, it's a tiny sliver of the expanding universe as it unfolds into human consciousness, into human knowledge.
Shall I show you the film?
Yeah.
Show bits. Yeah.
Could I just say something I think that's really interesting, because the roller is diagrammatic and therefore condenses all of this in a way different to reading the encyclopedia. So there's lots that's lost in that condensing, but we can grasp the point that you've just made through that through the roller blind, or as Mary demonstrated. So there is this kind of idea also now, though, that the AI, of course, can read an encyclopedia much faster than the human, and in Latham's time, I guess that kind of being didn't exist.
But I think that even
it might have done,
division
but not.
now. I mean, the encyclopedia now is Wikipedia, which is changing every second. I mean, every second we speak, it's being transformed, it's being expanded. There are kind of, editorial decisions being argued over by people who, spend their time wanting to kind of get involved in this collective project. It's a distributed and ever evolving human creation made possible through network technology and so on. So it's a very different sense than the encyclopedia as a book. When we now do that and say, like, you read the encyclopedia, you'll never get through it. There was the possibility that you could. I think there's a funny point in Lacan, and you never know with him, but he says to his the people at his seminar, well, you need to read the entire kind of encyclopedia, the French, the first encyclopedia to kind of understand what I'm saying or something, which is, I mean, and he probably has, but
well, it's interesting to think that maybe the mythical AI singularity, if it goes on the roller blind, is a new kind of time. I don't know, different to the human time of reading, which Latham was critical of, in a way. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe just before you show the film, I was speaking about encyclopedias, because this is quite relevant to kind of diagram. I always forget his name. What's his name? The guy who talks about the immutable mobiles. We've never been modern guy.
Latour.
Right.
Bruno Latour.
Latour. So Latour's idea is that the diagram is an immutable mobile. That is, it's something which can move around the world, can be printed in all different kinds of journals and papers, and now on screen, but originally, ever since the printing press, was able to be shared, but it didn't change form, right? This was very, very different from the kind of visual kind of transmission of knowledge through from earlier times, where there'd be subtle shifts of things. So there was no kind of standard in which things could be measured. As soon as you get a diagram that several people can look at in different contexts, then these things can be checked. The things that seem to be consistent, that stand up to the facts, that have kind of can be verified, that can be compared to other versions, that can be compared to, different kinds of diagrams and different images. That then is really where you kind of start building. This is where this complete transformation into the kind of modern age happens through this kind of material culture, in a way. It has nothing to do with, for Latour, it has nothing to do with a kind of shift in thinking or something, as if it was, as if we became new people. The people remain the same. It's just that we now have this technology that allows us to kind of compare these things. So that's the kind of significance of something like it finds a kind of apotheosis in something like the original kind of encyclopedia projects.
Mary, you should show your film.
Show the film. No, maybe it doesn't work. I'm not sure. Shall I try
Mary,
again?
I think you've got to act it out.
Yeah, just tell us.
In
Perform
mine.
it.
So what happens
Yay!
is that you see an Earth coming into view from space,
Yeah.
and then you get a least event, which is like the blackness of space and kind of sparkles, and then you get the view of Earth seen from the cosmos coming into view, and then there's a lot of black space for quite a few minutes. Nothing happens, and then the Earth comes into view as a bigger image. And then you can see aerial shots of Earth, of land and coastal, shots of the coasts on Earth. And then you can see the spine of the Britannica encyclopedia. And then you can see there's like almost a stop motion animation of the pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica moving in front of you so fast that you can barely see it. I think it's one frame, one page a frame. That's that fast. And then there's some kind of microbial life. And then you can kind of see a silhouette of a human climbing a mountain. And then it ends. So I think it's showing different kind of time bases.
That's a Latham film.
That's a Latham film.
What a shame we can't see that.
Yeah.
I know, but we'll be able to summon it if we communicate with the angels who are listening in. We'll be able to summon an image or a version of it in the future.
Rob and Matt Angels. Please come to the film.
Come help us. It's interesting because there's something in the description that you said. There's a couple of things that stand out for me, and one is that this idea of the cosmic zoom, or the idea that we go from a bigger scale to a smaller scale, that we zoom in, and the idea of the zoom is kind of an interesting concept. We keep coming back to that. In fact, we're zooming all over. We've got Zoom recorders, Zoom platforms, and the zoom is this sort of thing, right? But anyway, I'm talking about this cosmic zoom, and the idea that when you transition from one level to another. So there's something not quite right for me about how can I say it? Doesn't sit so well about why the encyclopedia occurs on the coastline. Now, I understand the coastline because that's one of those fractal moments, and it's kind of like totally Mandelbrot, and it's probably something that I guess fractals are Mandelbrots for things that Latham would have been aware of or conscious of. So the shoreline is the classic, no matter how far in you go, the pattern stays the same thing. But then why the switch to the register at that point? There's a kind of weird, in terms of human evolution or the evolution of life on the planet or something, why the encyclopedia happens there, and then why you go to microbes after that.
I did have a sort of interpretation.
Yeah.
So there was the least event, which is the cosmos. Nothing has happened yet. And then you get these tiny little sparkles, so maybe they are the least events, the kind of very smallest event possible. And then you get Earth, species happened, life. And then you get city shots, so maybe that's mitya, that's the instinctive human body survival, kind of like humans have started. And then there's encyclopedia, which is the rational Ivan. And then I kind of lose it a bit because I'm not sure where the intuitive Aloysia comes in. But there's kind of, I think they're described as microbial life in a text that I read, maybe by Velios. But I'm not sure why things disintegrate. Maybe that's starting to be the end of the universe, and then it comes back around again.
Yes, because the U to Z section in the spectrum is a bit of a mystery. You might be right, because he might be having a kind of a go at an analogy or a metaphor, because he hasn't got a theory of entropy. It seems. But if you treated this film and Latham's diagrams and the roller blind as creation myths. Let's say that you went in as a kind of anthropologist. It seems the basis of that myth is this least event. It's like without the least event myth, which might turn out to be a myth now, that if gravitons are really there, which scientists say they think they are there through the LIGO experiment. So the whole thing is a kind of creation myth that this least event kind of underpins in a way.
So say that bit again. Why would the graviton mean that there was no Big Bang? Or that the universe was always existing?
You remember last week I talked about Penrose. So I tried to suggest that if you added gravity and entropy to Latham's diagram, you could have two kinds of entropy. This is what Penrose says, where the entropy that Dean described, the heat entropy, occurs at the point where all the black holes clump together towards further along in the universe, which is, according to Penrose, maximum entropy in relation to gravity. But because the black holes suck everything in, the universe around gets cooler than the black hole, and then another kind of entropy takes over, which might be the U to Z bit. But at the very so there's that issue, but at the very beginning, in the least event or in the quantum, Latham suggested that there cannot be gravity or space. There's just time, because there's an event. But Smolin and Ravelli or Rivolo, I can't remember how you say his name. Ravelli, and others, with their quantum loop gravity theory, suggest that there's a kind of fabric. There is a series of, I think it's gluons and quarks, which are actually space-time. That's what space-time is. And that there's gravity at the quantum level, which would be a problem for Latham's theory. And that when the LIGO scientists, the scientists that detected the gravity waves of the colliding black holes, I think I said this last week, when they processed information, they found a chirp which they said sounded like this piano C to lower C to middle C, and they began thinking about this as the graviton, as a wave that carries gravity, or carries the force of gravity. There is something in the archive which Victoria Gallagher, I don't know who she is, but she wrote to Latham saying that if this graviton exists, it would be produced by a black hole, and scientists would need to find that graviton, but nothing escapes the black hole apart
That's
from
in the archive,
radiation.
David.
Yeah,
Really?
it's a little letter. So she says, don't worry, because the graviton can't escape the black hole anyway, so it's futile. But the scientists were cleverer than that, and they detected two black holes colliding.
The funny thing about the two black holes colliding, which are obviously kind of enormous things, but the way they detected that was in this little. I heard it. They played it kind of somewhere. It's just this little click. It's like a little click. Apparently, it lasts 1/10 of a second. So these two enormous kind of things in the universe are represented or are kind of indexed by this 1/10 of a second click.
Yeah, it's like a Robert.
That's the chirp.
Yes.
Is that the chirp? That must be the chirp. Yeah.
It's like a Robert Smithson work where they fire lasers.
It doesn't sound very.
Right angles.
It doesn't sound very exciting, does it? I mean, it's not like sci-fi films or something like that. But
no,
it's kind of funny.
But it does raise interesting questions about astrophysics and events and perception, and I was sort of confused because about when Mary, you said, if I'm correct, that the least event has something to do with this 1/24 of a second film thing, right?
I don't think it has myself. I think that happens later.
I think
Later in
I think
time.
that the least event would have to be something like the smallest measurable thing, which probably will be a
Much
Planck
more, yes,
or a
yeah.
photon.
And that's I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, just to tease that out, which is because on the one hand there's the least perceptible event for humans, and there's the least conceptual event for physics, and we
not conceptual but measurable.
Okay, measurable event. Sorry, yeah, measurable event. And because of our tools, because of our telescopes and electron microscopes and electro radio wave telescopes that can now see the outer limits of the universe, which no human possibly could unaided, we have these technological devices. And as I understand astrophysics,
I don't think they can see the outer limits. Is not the right way. Maybe
what
to
I'm
think
trying
about
to say,
it.
what I'm trying to say is that let's just say we can't see Mars with the naked eye, but we can see Mars with well, we can see it as a dot.
We can see it as a dot, yeah.
Yeah, we see it as a tiny dot. We've got no detail. We can't see the rings of Saturn. Let's just say that then. We can't see the rings of Saturn with the naked eye, but we can with a telescope. So the telescope allows us to see something that's imperceptible to us, without devices, without technology, and the fact that it's the technology that enables us to perceive something. And I'm sure this is okay. I can't remember the name of the astrophysicist at the big science college in London, in the Royal College of Art, Italian. But he had this thing on his desk when we visited him that said that everything is lensed, and he was somebody who was working with this. So what I'm teasing out here is I know that people can hear the Big Bang, or there's this thing like this chirp. There are these astrophysical events.
They can hear two black holes colliding.
Right, there's an index. We can now trace. It's been called the Arche fossil as well in by other people. Right, there's this idea that we are able to perceive microscopic or megascopic events that we can't do unaided to the naked eye or with our senses because they're beyond the threshold. So I'm just trying to tease out really what that threshold is, what the difference between an aided threshold and the unaided threshold of perception is.
But also sometimes it's not even perception, so the understanding of string theory is surely theoretical.
But it's also metaphorical, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I'm not convinced by that thing about the vibration. Like the vibration in the string theory seems like it's a total, like that seems like a total analogy, to make it a little bit more understandable,
digestible.
I mean, it's even like I think Heisenberg used to get really annoyed by those which we still have, right? Those little diagrams of the atom and stuff, as if they were kind of Newtonian planets, as if the electron was circling around the, and he was like, this is absolute nonsense. It's like a foggy cloud that we can't understand, basically. It's pure uncertainty. So these are kind of unhelpful analogies, actually. So we have the wavelengths, obviously, which is a vibration.
I would park string theory myself.
You park it, yeah.
Yes, because I don't know enough about it, but also I've read Lee Smollin's stuff on it, and he's questioning whether it's science because it's theoretical and it cannot be falsified. And it seems like this is. Having said that, quantum loop gravity theory, you cannot be seen with human eye or with any kind of technical device. So it might be something that could be seen as what reality is if certain other experiments or observations lead that way.
It's very different. I mean, I wonder, the black and white thing, I wonder if this is about the way that outer space has been visualized, because these days it's very much color, and what the Hubble telescope thing, they did a very good job of kind of romanticizing visually the creation of stars and all that kind of thing, so they look like a big John Martin painting or something. It was kind of incredible, but obviously this is very aesthetic. There's a lot of kind of colouring and aesthetic decisions going on, and even about how you frame it, which way round you put it, and all that. So there's that famous one of the kind of three stacks with the stars being born, but why is it that way round? For some reason that looks more like a kind of Earth landscape to us, in terms of gravity and so on. So they could probably do wonders with that little tenth of a second click and make it stretch it out and add various put it through various modulators and so on and whatever, and would get something a bit more dramatic, a bit more kind of Star Wars, epic.
But the thing about the click is it's real. It's a real index.
It's real, and so is the birth of stars at the Hubble telescope. Although that does it optically, so it's obviously a little bit kind of closer. But the click is real.
But what John was getting at,
and the string theory is not, and a lot of the nuclear theory is not. That's not.
Or it's a question.
It's mathematics.
I wouldn't dismiss it because I don't know. Yeah, but what John was getting at, I think, it's kind of complex to unpick. But it makes me think about Bruno Latour's questions around science. First of all, bracketing off culture, and also not being aware of the mediators, or perhaps not thinking about the mediators, which I think we've discussed, because I brought up Kip Thorne's computer modelling of the black hole collision, and I think Latour says something like some mediators are vehicles. They bring you, like the LIGO, I guess, would be a kind of vehicle for bringing you information. So the chirp, which is detected by two lasers, I think, at the same time, firing in different directions, is a vehicle. But then there are some vehicles, some mediators that are translators, and that they produce what they present to an extent, to a greater or lesser extent, which I think is, maybe goes back to the point that if you're going to have this idea of a camera moving from the least event to the microbe, the logic of that, of the camera itself, and also of this kind of descent, to a certain extent produces the diagrammatic timeline that the film presents. So it will not necessarily coincide with reality. It'll always be a translation of reality in which the mediating aspect will be the concept of the fool and the camera itself. And I think that really relates to diagrams. The point that we've been making is that artists are really aware of that, or a little bit suspicious when that's not considered, because a diagram is a physical thing. It's like it matters to us whether it's made on a computer or with a bit of charcoal. It's not that one is better than the other, but we know that those mediums allow for different things, which is, I think, where Latour's observations could go. But the thing that really interested me in your talk, Mary, was when you showed and talked about the roller blind and the chair, and I think Latham, if he's not aware of that in the film, but I think he would be, his diagrams, or his object diagrams, they kind of are aware of their mediation. And the fascinating thing about that roller blind is that if he sits in the chair, because John, you once talked about, or maybe Gareth talked about it as well, but you said, Latham's there, he's in that chair to talk about the roller blind. But the chair is also in the roller blind. He can sit from the chair and say, I'm there. And there's this interesting double perspective, which is about understanding mediation, I think, in which Latham places these things in the world as events in time. So therefore they're kind of time-based objects. But they're also, whether he would agree with this, they're also kind of devoid of time. They're like a forgetting of time, so that they can be diagrams to present all time. That, and I think Latham's approach as an artist, because he's aware of mediation, is something that you don't find in science, because that's just not useful to them. When you watch a scientist draw a black hole on a board with chalk, it's kind of amazing, because everybody is there. Everybody sees a black hole in the room.
Yeah,
but
it's just a word has come to my head that I don't think we've maybe discussed, and it's a very straightforward word, which is demonstration. They're kind of demonstrations, or there's something about the demonstrative, like they're that's just I don't know. I'll have to think more about that word, which is a very obvious, well used word. But diagrams are demonstrative too. They operate. That's one of their functions. They demonstrate something, and like Latham's roller and all the artworks, it feels to me, are not just artworks. They're all demonstrations.
Maybe the film is more problematic because a film, as Benjamin kind of wrote about, it just unfolds in time, and you're quite passive within it somehow, and you're kind of just a pair of eyes. Although it sounds a great film, and it's like that we discussed, I think it's 10 times 10 times 10, or Power of Tens, the Ames film. This sounds a bit more sophisticated. But can I show these three artworks then in relation to what you said, John? Is that all right? And if I can find them. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the first one, I think it's called, I didn't actually note what the title was, but I think it's called Greaser from 1976. And Terry Atkinson made all these works. It's by Terry Atkinson. He made these works which the logic of it was most of the time artwork is in storage. And then sometimes it comes out. And he said that he'd made a work which changed every time it's shown in relation to how it was stored. And he suggested that this was like AI. Maybe it can go... Can you see that?
Yeah.
So it's not a very good resolution image, but apparently he put grease in it and made a packing case for it. And so when it was shown, whether it was bought or it came back to Atkinson because it was unbought, he would store it, and whatever way he stored it, entropy would make the grease move, which I guess kind of gets less movable over time. And I think that there's something about the time-basedness of that work that related to Latham.
Can I just jump in there just quickly? Yeah. I'm reminded, this is just an association, that Rauschenberg was really important for Latham, and Rauschenberg keeps coming back in this moment in the 50s and early 60s. And I was speaking to our colleague Nat Pitt yesterday, and he said that Rauschenberg, towards the end of his life, was designing paintings that would fit within the Boeing 747 storage hold.
Wow.
And I was sort of intrigued by that, because that felt very sort of Latham in a way. Like conceptually, like the painting is determined by extrinsic parameters which have to do with, and of course it can be looked at as just a cynical, he sold big paintings that needed to be as big as possible and fly around the world. But those two things aren't not connected. Like the storage of art, the transportation of art, these are, for Latham, these are all part of the artwork's process of being in the world, right? So anyway, I just through that, I was just reminded of that.
I think you're right, because Rob, do you remember Rob sent us that letter to the Listen Gallery, Nicholas Sirota, trying to explain how the work is made, the work is shown. There were, I think, I can't remember it exactly, but there were kind of 6, we could call them levels or durations of the work. So I think you're right there. And
he indexed it, so there's that indexing of the work. Each time it shifts transition space, it becomes a new index.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mary.
I think Gareth said that Latham got the idea for the time-based roller in the first place because he had to roll up his canvases to save on storage space.
I think you're right, because there's that big painting, isn't there, that is like a blind.
Yeah. Which has those vertical colour strips.
I wonder how all this fits into this kind of constantly repeated idea that Latham was against space and objects. This seems to be our discussion now, and your image and the discussion around that that John picked up on of that photo of the chair. Which also, it seems to me like a really kind of intriguing image of the roller with the chair, because what that roller suddenly reminds me of there is an optician going into the opticians and having that chart of all the letters, and sometimes they would kind of roll down, but there'd be a chair for you to sit on, but this chair's obviously for pointing a stick at, like John says, and kind of explaining it. There is something in John Latham of the time machine, like the H.G. Wells, the fact that somebody, some gentleman has constructed in his workshop from mahogany or something, some kind of beautifully rendered kind of machine that just sits there in the parlour or whatever, and then you can sit on it and you can kind of go back in time, or he goes forward in time, doesn't he? So there's something very much about space and objects and matter and all these things. How do you?
I think the space and the object massness of things, I don't know, but I haven't come across anything where Latham has really kind of dealt with it other than to deny that as important somehow. Obviously at a certain point space happens, gravity happens, he acknowledges that, but in relation to what you were saying, it was making me think, well, there is this kind of conceptual art critique of the object for all sorts of reasons, like anti-Greenberg or commodity or whatever. Sorry, thank you, John, that's the word I'm looking for. And somehow that's carried through in Atkinson's object, because each time it's shown it's different, so it's not the same thing.
Well, it's a difference between an object and matter, isn't it? I notice in our blurb describing what we're doing, we say we're against space and matter, which I think is wrong. I think actually for us, I think we say it. We're interested in looking at this. I think we should say objects. We should change it to objects. I don't know how it became matter, because I think
the only thing there,
the question of matter is obviously, that's the whole point of this Atkinson piece we're looking at, right? The difference
I think you're
between
right.
matter
I think you're right about matter as well. But the only thing I was thinking when you were speaking, Dean, was like we've talked before about Chatelet having this idea of a diagram as not exhausted like a metaphor, because each instantiation, each reading is a new gesture, possibly, and I think that's that might be close to how Latham thinks about artworks, or what Mary and John have articulated, that each time the artwork comes out, it's new and different, and in the way Atkinson was trying to index that or show that. And it also makes me think of this idea that Robert Smithson had. Smithson wrote that the time of the artist is what's important, not the things that they produce, not the objects. And he suggested that the time of the artist is actually bracketed out when objects are shown, when things are shown. It's hard to think like how he would be successful if those objects couldn't circulate and be bought. But I think this is why Smithson did all that writing and made that film Spiral Jetty, which was one of the images I was going to show. And I think the time of the artist is not easy to for artists to kind of circulate in some way, but maybe Latham and Atkinson are trying to objectify that, I'd say, in some way, and also kind of in a diagrammatic sense make something that's different each iteration, or each time it's shown it's a different diagrammatic iteration or a different iteration.
I mean, it's in the New Spirit of Capitalism. This is what Ciapello and Boltanski talk about in terms of new notions of justice. New notions of justice have to take into consideration the fact that the person who gets the credit for something does that through a system of circulation that they don't have the time to make possible. So it involves other people's time. So everything involves people's time. So the bracketing is perhaps quite an interesting area to look at, but obviously it doesn't get looked at, it gets bracketed in that sense. But there is a lot of circulation on a kind of human timescale going on to make, to get objects into Boeing 747s and installed and archived, and all this separation, which is the kind of negentropic aspect, is a question of human time, lifespans, which is not necessarily measured in money. So the whole question of value, which Latham kind of brings up, in terms of what does he call it? The delta level of attention and that kind of thing, is kind of interesting in this respect. It's a different kind of time, but maybe the way that Latham does, in a seemingly quite odd idiosyncratic way, bring in different aspects of time from the cosmic level to suddenly talking about, or the cosmic event to suddenly talking about the political event or something, might give us some kind of framework to be able to, let's say, de-bracket that part of the equation and look a bit closer at that, expand it, blow it up.
Yeah, can I just jump in? Sort of like, okay, great. Everything that you're saying seems to, for me, be resonating around a question that I've been wanted to bring up here. Around the resolution of this image. It's quite pixelated. It's an image which has obviously been compressed digitally to facilitate it being distributable on screen. I reckon it's probably about 72 dpi if we go back to the question of scanning and resolution. And you're talking about matter and, this question of matter and materiality. And I'm assuming, obviously, I guess you all know, you can all hear the Walter Benjamin argument coming in here, but I think it's around the reproduction of the image. But presumably the Greaser title and the physical material properties of that work are really, really important for it. And that we're just looking at a reduced 72 dpi, scan of
you
an
can't
object.
you'd be able to smell the grease, wouldn't you?
All of
really
it, all those material properties of the artifact, the object, are absolutely necessary. But we're never going to get that through a screen anyway. I know this from working with my students. I'm trying to do a project with them to get them to find high resolution images, and it's very difficult for them when they don't understand resolution and they're detached from even the relationship between resolution, the dot matrix of the printer that the scanner was designed to, so there's been a separation through the scanner and the dot and the pixel and the dot. That's all to do with digital compression and being able to share documents online, etc., etc. So the digital has moved us a long way from the materiality of this physical object. So it can sound like I'm criticizing you, David, for not giving us a
No, it's interesting. But I think it's an interesting point. I wonder what Terry Atkinson would make of it. I've met Terry, and I think my memory is that he talks about this as an AI. And also, I think he's super critical of aesthetics and the sensory, but actually all his work following art and language has a strange kind of materiality. His drawings of soldiers are great, his drawings are great as well.
I mean, my instincts tell me that this
Can I
should
just
be
say
seen.
something?
Yeah.
Can I just say something there? But, it might be you're right. And I think Atkinson is influenced by what's going on in the art world around him. And there's a kind of move away from conceptual art eventually that is just text. And he does introduce images and he kind of moves towards representation. But I think he still retains this idea of the conceptual. So it's interesting to me that he calls this an AI. Now that either means that the grease is kind of intelligent in some way, which I read that as well, but also that it's the idea of the artwork as some kind of intelligent machine. And I think there's also an element of this work which enters into our imagination, which is what happens in diagrams, where we don't have to have some authentic substance. Like scientists don't have to have actual ice or water in front of them to make steam, ice, and liquid water.
But that's what Châtelet would say. You need an analogy, which for him is embodied. So, for example, he calls Maxwell's corkscrew. I think last week I said it was Faraday, which was an error, which remains.
Right.
But I didn't want to point it out, Dean. I just let it go.
Well, thanks for that, John. Yeah, I wasn't the only one, but. For Châtelet, the corkscrew analogy is a robot. So he says that what Maxwell does there is he takes the little man, the Ampere's little man, and he turns it into a robot. So which seems quite metaphorical itself, but it's the sense that this is an image for sure, but it's an embodied image. It's an image which suggests a kind of entering into a physical space, right? But we can do that in the mind, and that's what the diagram allows. I mean, the diagram allows us to enter into this kind of physical space, which is why it's maybe, as you were saying, it has a kind of there's something a bit more kind of consistent about the diagram than the metaphor, because it captures that gesture, as he would say. It captures a gesture in such a way that it then enables another gesture to kind of be relayed forward, in this strange.
Just saying, this image, I mean, for me, I think this touches on something that I think we've been discussing and I feel maybe arguing about for a long time, even beyond the parameters of this particular space-time event which are in here. And so that, to me, that has to do with the primacy of the material artifact relative to its schematization. And the more this image is digitally reduced and impoverished, the more it becomes like a schema. And the further we go in the opposite direction, which no resolution would ever be able to capture because resolution only operates on a two-dimensional plane, and this is a three-dimensional object and needs to be a three-dimensional object, as it wouldn't be what it was. It wouldn't do the work it does as an artistic work and as a diagrammatic work of the kind that isn't a schema, an abstract schema. So I think there's a push and pull there, and I keep wanting to push back to the physical artifact, the existent object, three-dimensional object in space and time, and its physical material properties. And there's a pull towards this scanning AI digital movement and the diagrammatics of that. And I think there's a push and pull here that I think I feel this object is right on that.
But isn't there a difference between understanding the object's qualities, and which is valuable, and then the diagrammatic and schematic aspects as well, which are still communicated in some sense through the discourse applied to a schema?
Yeah.
I mean,
Michael Marinon, in one of the texts that we read, or one of the books that we read, Thinking of Diagrams, he talks about diagrammatic thinking in relation to landscapes from the 1700s. And for him, he says he can't separate the material properties of a painting with its schematics, because the material property of the painting or the diagram will give you some information. For example, if the clouds are painted in a very thick and pastel way, they'll kind of relate to another part of the painting that is painted in a similar way, or kind of dots of light will connect different parts of the painting together and will help you enter into the space of the painting. So you could imagine yourself walking into it and moving parts about. And he relates that to Frederick Sternfeld, who talks about how once you're looking at a diagram and moving parts around in your head, you're operating on a diagram. And so that's the analogy he connects looking at a painting.
He's picking up on that. He picks on up on the point in Peirce, doesn't he? Where Peirce says there's a moment when you're operating on the diagram, which operating on the diagram simply means you're kind of engaging with, the relation of its parts, where it becomes the very thing, right? It becomes the very thing, and it goes back to this question of the firstness of the diagram. Well, the diagram is a kind of second order firstness, whereas the image is or the picture is a first order firstness, in the sense that a painting of a landscape is an icon that seems real. We accept it as, on some level, that is the landscape or whatever. Whereas the diagram, because of its schematic qualities, there's a kind of abstraction, but there is still this moment, which is this kind of moment when you enter into the problem, where the diagram poses a kind of problem, you kind of enter into it, and he talks about geometry being like that. So when you're dealing with kind of geometrical figures, there is a point where the shape of the triangle or whatever it is, or the particular geometrical problem, is the thing. It's not representing anything. It is the thing itself. But I think for me, maybe the problem with that kind of, because I think Marinan it seems to be influenced by Latour, but the problem with the kind of the Latourian perspective, which is very material, it's a kind of material culture perspective, but it's very much about how these objects exist in the world, rather than a process of diagramming, and it seems to me the difference between the diagram and diagramming is this question of when we enter into the kind of physicality of something. So it's not simply about, you know, the poverty of the image versus these, you know, when we used to go into the slide library and pick out these beautiful kind of slides or whatever and put them in a projector and something, but there's a kind of there's a kind of embodied aspect of you know, which gets forgotten and lost and as if it never existed or something. A bit like you know, what happens to the artwork when it gets shown or something, and then the time of the artist disappears. You know, it's like the time of the diagramming is lost in this kind of schema.
Well, I think what we're talking about to an extent is mediation, which I think Latham doesn't necessarily address directly, no. But it might be a decision whether you value the idea of the material qualities of things, which supposedly transcend time, but are what allows certain things to be mediated. I mean, I think what you're saying, John, is kind of right, is that all digitization creates something different to an object that's been digitized.
I would say, and I didn't want to rehearse the whole Benjamin thing, but I think it's an overdetermined thesis, but about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and that was photography, and it was about circulation and distribution and mediation, and the artwork was freed from its relationship to the museum and the gallery, and it became political, etc., etc. All that stuff was great, and it also fed into the digitization. Digitization is just another step in photography. That's why I was trying to make the correlation between the dot matrix of a halftone print and the scanner, which turns it from ink into light. And then once everything can be digitized, then all images can go through this increased intensification process. And the idea that the artwork actually needs to be seen in the flesh, or that it actually has its physicality is an essential part of it, isn't, I don't believe, just some bourgeois 19th century myth. And in this case, that's what I'm trying to get at, that I even believe for Atkinson, for all his conceptualism and art and language stuff, the grease of this object, the physical, I can't even see it. That's why I'm hungry for a high resolution image, because I want to know, like, what has the grease done to the surface of the painting? What kind of wood is that?
It goes down the channels, I think. It can even drop off.
Right, you see what I mean, right? Like, that is an understanding and a logic, and those understandings of that work are only properly understandable if you see the physical object. You wouldn't understand grease dripping through wood and going through cracks and the material change.
I think you would if you understand what grease is, because you'd use abduction, and someone can tell you about something. I mean, I think that there's a difference. I think
that's completely not discernible from this image.
No,
and it also isn't what you introduce this image as being about.
But diagrams are like a diagram of a circle and a wedge painted white and red are not discernible as a revolution unless some words are added. And I would
don't get me started on that.
So at the same time, I think that there is an artwork which Atkinson made that exists in time, and every time it's stored, it changes because it's he calls it AI, and that's important. But
the title AI is misleading here.
It isn't a title.
Misleading.
It isn't a title.
Okay.
It's what Atkinson said about this work. Okay. He said that because he's made all this stuff about artificial intelligence right from the 70s. So, but the other thing is that Atkinson is very much a believer in pedagogic art and didacticism, and I don't think he would have a problem necessarily with someone using that image to discuss the ideas that he, as a conceptual artist, might be, or he wouldn't identify as a conceptual artist, but as an artist who's critical of the material object, which has, that's part of what he's trying to do, I guess, is kind of put forward this idea about an artwork as not this material object that has value that you sell. So
but it is a material object, and it needs to be a material object.
It is.
There might be a difference between talking about this image, let's say doing a lecture. You show a good quality, you show a very high resolution version of this, which takes time to find, right?
That's what I'm getting
don't
at. That's
just take the first thing that comes up on Google search. You're talking about the same image, but it's not the same image, is it? It's
No.
different. You notice you're saying exactly the same thing, but what is being learnt in this pedagogical situation might be different because your bandwidth is bigger. There's more information there. If you talked about it in front of the actual thing, I mean, I was just thinking.
What I would say,
this is just
come
a
in
question. Hang on, sorry, I'll just ask a question then.
Yeah.
Could you construct a diagram completely out of smells, a darkened space with smells, for example? I don't know, but yeah, go on.
I don't think so. That comes back to the audio thing. But what I would say is my approach to this is diagrammatic, in that I can watch on YouTube Susskind or an astrophysicist produce a diagram, Penrose produce a diagram, and I can reproduce that diagram in a seminar, or I could show that like I've taken a screen grab.
Yeah, this is a difference between a type and a token, right? So you're talking about the diagram.
Hang on. But somewhere in that presentation is my experience of that first work. I mean, I've never actually seen this work or any of the greasers' works in the flesh. Yet I know about that, and as you say, it's an embodied image. So I agree, it's not it's not the same as looking at the actual thing. And Latham would tell us that each time we come to look at it, it's a different thing. And Atkinson would say as well that, well, it was been stored for a month, so it's different. That there's something about the reality of the object which does help produce the idea that can be schematized.
Okay,
but I think it's not a question of saying one is better than the other. I think
they're different.
That's all I would say.
But they're qualitatively and conceptually different, and that has huge implications for everything we're talking about.
But they're also related.
It's not a qualitative. Yeah, they are, but it's not like, I think sometimes it's as if like by saying that the physical material properties of any object, doesn't have to be an artwork, are important for understanding the meaning and operative processes that are built into that thing. It can come. Sometimes it comes across that that's aestheticism or some kind of outmoded approach to objects, and it's absolutely not. It's absolutely fundamental to understanding reality.
But I don't think
it's a phenomenological approach to diagrams. It's like it's a different thing. I mean,
I don't think you have to experience it though, because as Dean said, there's embodiment and there's imagination, and that's what diagram often pulls out.
Well, there's all these things.
It's important. Just to finish, it's important that Atkinson made a physical object, and also it's important that he called it AI, and that because you wouldn't know from looking at it that it's any different from how it's previously shown as well. There's nothing really about the object itself which tells you it might have gone through like 20, 30 different storings, and without that knowledge, you wouldn't know. Yeah, you'd have to see images. So I think that there's a little bit of a kind of purifying going on here between the real thing and its mediation, because you could argue to a certain extent all things are mediated in one way or another in art.
So
and I think that was the point of conceptual art.
Pick up on this mediation thing, just to bring it back to Mary's description of the film and something John said, which was about this coastline, right? And the fact that you didn't think that was a compelling
segue.
Juxtaposition.
That's where it segued into the.
No, there's kind of an interesting thing in the way because Latour actually talks about coastlines he says the lepton and the coastline and the GDP don't exist except as representations, right? They don't exist except through their mediation as representations. And he talks about diagrams being closed, like diagrams are the thing that close reality, right? Now, this is quite interesting when you think of someone like Sternfeld talking about Peirce, where he talks about the diagram as a skeleton-like relation. It's like a skeleton. It's a kind of stripping down of reality into its kind of bare bones. So I'm interested. I don't know what you think about it, and maybe we haven't got time, but it's just Mary bringing it up and you kind of juxtaposing it. Just it's a kind of interesting kind of are they kind of opposed ways of thinking about the diagram as a kind of stripped down to a skeleton, and the other hand as something which is clothing a certain kind of nakedness or a certain kind of reality. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting because I related the coastline to civilization, although you wouldn't. I didn't understand why I thought that, because I thought a coastline is a geographical reality, but you're saying that Bruno Tor said that the coastline only exists as a
map or
yeah,
or as a kind of one of those fractal diagrams or whatever. Yeah, it's somebody's gone out, with a ruler and measured it or whatever, however they do these things kind of mathematically or whatever. But
there is no coastline.
Yeah, there was that famous, was it an essay or something? How was that, the Mandelbrot essay? How long's the coastline of Britain or something? It depends how closely
it depends how you measure it. It depends how detailed you go into the chaos of all the ridges,
which is a kind of
and how far out the tide is, right? I mean, the tides change. Tides, the tide means that there is no fixed coastline. It's constantly moving, constantly coming in and out.
Yeah, it's like Wikipedia. It's constantly changing as we speak.
I mean, what's interesting, I don't think this is an answer, but what's interesting is if you took what John just said, like the fact that the coastline changes because the tide moves in and out, if you were a conceptual artist and said, here's the representation or the diagram of the coastline, it's this walk I've gone on and you've got to walk around it, that would be like a one-to-one phenomenological, physical encounter with something, with a kind of image that is also physical and material. And I think that is interesting because that introduces human scale and human limits, and also the fact that the material of a diagram, like the grease, is a thing that changes in time. And then there's the other diagram, which is the sort of satellite image from above that traces a contour because it says like that's a coastline, but it's only because it's physically so far from something. So you've got kind of a level of abstraction and not a level of representation, but a level of materiality, I think, on a kind of scale. You kind of can do a lot with the abstract, but maybe what John is arguing for is a kind of richer diagrammatics, because it takes on something that's outside of diagrammatic abstraction. It's that's an interesting thing. That's what Latham might be doing. That's what
I think. I think it was Gareth told us a story about Latham with the pouring the water on the sheet of glass.
Yeah,
and just increasingly pouring the water. I think that's close to this. Like it needed the material property of glass that that has a breaking point, and when that breaking point is reached, you have a catastrophe that will be a physical material shock event. That tension is kind of, you can talk about that abstractly, conceptually and diagrammatically, but the potential event of it, or the knowledge of the event of it, is something else, and is needed for it.
I think what you're not just arguing for materiality, you're also arguing for time, I guess.
And absolutely.
And that's and I would say that is a really important thing to discuss, but it also will have its limits, particularly if, like Latham, you're trying to diagram something that's not present to us, like a proton or... So the interesting thing is that... Sorry, photon.
Or a proton.
But the interesting thing is, I think that Latham is trying to do that, but also trying to do what John is suggesting. That's the double perspective, maybe. And I just would say I'm not against the non-material diagram, and I think that also digital images have a sort of embodied and physical relationship. But I totally get what you're saying, John.
I think they are. Yeah, they are embodied, aren't they? They haven't. That's the problem, really.
But not in the same way.
Embodied.
Not in the same way John is saying. If you're standing in front of the grease,
but we have a phenomenological experience.
We do
in front of these poor images, don't we? That is
giving me a migraine.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I show 2 other images just quickly? I don't know if they're going to be...
We're kind of up to time, but I'm happy to go a bit further.
You just talked about the limits of time, and I thought that might be a good kind of...
Okay.
They're very interesting diagrams and images you picked up, David. Maybe I'm happy to talk about them next week.
Yeah, that is just spiral jetty covered in salt, and I don't know whether it's a diagram or not, and this has always fascinated me because it's Carolee Schneemann, and it's called Up to and Including Her Limits, I think. But anyway, okay, let's call it